The wind had stripped everything away except her pride, and when Frances Emmett opened her eyes to see the stranger dismounting in what used to be her front yard, she knew her life was about to change in ways the tornado never could. The storm had come through Rock Springs, Wyoming like the devil's own fury, 2 hours before dawn, ripping the roof clean off her small homestead and shattering every window until glass sparkled in the dirt like scattered diamonds. Frances had huddled in the root cellar, listening to the world tear itself apart above her head, praying for dawn and wondering if she would survive to see it. When the howling finally stopped and she climbed up the ladder, she found her home transformed into little more than walls and memories. The June morning sun poured through the open sky where her ceiling used to be, illuminating the destruction with cruel brightness. Everything she owned that had not been nailed down was simply gone, carried off into the Wyoming wilderness by winds that cared nothing for the years of work she had put into this place. But Frances was still standing. Covered in dust, her long auburn hair tangled and wild, her simple cotton dress torn at the hem, she stood in the middle of what used to be her parlor and refused to cry. She had come west 3 years ago after her father died, determined to make something of the 160 acres he had claimed, but never properly settled. She had survived harsh winters, scorching summers, loneliness that ate at her soul, and the constant struggle of working land that seemed determined to reject her efforts. She would survive this too. She had to. That was when she heard the horse. Frances turned, one hand instinctively going to smooth her hair before she remembered how she must look, and saw the rider approaching from the east road. He sat tall in the saddle, silhouetted against the morning sun, and even from a distance she could see he rode with the easy confidence of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on foot. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. He was young, probably not much older than her own 24 years, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble on his strong jaw. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, worn denim pants, a dark shirt, a leather vest, and a hat that had seen better days. A bedroll was tied behind his saddle, and she could see the handle of a rifle in its scabbard. He stopped his horse about 20 feet from where she stood and took in the destruction with eyes that were a striking shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains. Then those eyes found her, and something in his expression shifted. Not pity exactly, but recognition, as if he understood what it meant to lose everything and still keep standing. "Madam," he said, his voice a low drawl that spoke of Texas or maybe Oklahoma, "looks like you had some trouble." Despite everything, Frances felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. It came out sounding slightly hysterical, but it was better than crying. That is one way to describe it. He dismounted in one fluid motion, dropping the reins to ground tie his horse, a well-trained roan gelding that stood patiently despite the strange surroundings. Up close, she could see he was taller than she had thought, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a man who worked hard for his living. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, barely visible unless you were looking for it, and his hands were calloused and strong. He was handsome in a rough, unpolished way that made her pulse quicken despite the disaster surrounding them. "Name is Ryder Xander," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was old-fashioned and somehow comforting. "I was passing through, heading north to a ranch job near the Montana border. Saw what the storm did from a few miles out and figured someone might need help." "Frances Emmett," she replied, trying for dignity even though she was standing in the ruins of her home with her hair looking like a bird's nest. "I appreciate the concern, Mr. Xander, but I will manage." "I am sure you will," he said, and there was no condescension in his tone. "But managing might go easier with an extra pair of hands. That storm covered a lot of ground. I would bet most of your neighbors are dealing with their own damage. Could be a while before anyone else comes checking on you." He was right, of course. The nearest homestead was the Patterson place, 3 miles west, and they had their own struggles. Old Tom Patterson was recovering from a broken leg, and his wife Sarah was caring for their new baby and 2 other children under the age of 5. Beyond them was the small town of Rock Springs itself, about 8 miles southeast, but the town had been directly in the storm's path. God only knew what state it was in. "I do not have money to pay for labor," Frances said bluntly. She had never been good at accepting charity, and she was not about to start now. "Did I ask for payment?" Ryder's eyebrows rose slightly. "Lady, I am offering to help you pick up the pieces before you lose what little you have left. Those clouds to the west look like more weather coming. You want to stand here arguing about pride, or you want to see what we can salvage before the next storm hits?" Frances looked at him for a long moment, weighing her options and her instincts. She had learned to be cautious around strangers, especially men, in her 3 years of living alone on the Wyoming frontier. But there was something in Ryder Xander's eyes that seemed honest. More than that, there was a weariness there that she recognized, the look of someone who had been knocked down by life and had to climb back to his feet more than once. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you. I would appreciate the help." He nodded once, apparently satisfied, and turned to survey the damage with a critical eye. "First thing is to see what we can recover. Your furniture, clothes, anything that might have blown into the surrounding area. Then we need to secure what is left of the structure. You have a barn." "About 50 yards that way," Frances pointed to the east, where her small barn still stood, looking miraculously intact. "The animals were spooked, but they seem all right. I have 2 milk cows, a few chickens, and an old plow horse." "Good. We can use the barn for storage and shelter if we need it. You have tools. Hammer, nails, rope, tarp, some. They were in the barn, so they should still be there. Then let us get started. Sun is burning daylight." They worked for hours without stopping, and Frances found herself grateful for Ryder's presence in ways she had not expected. He was efficient and practical, making decisions quickly but never without consulting her first. Together they scoured the area surrounding the house, finding pieces of her life scattered across the prairie. A cooking pot lodged in a sage bush 300 yards away. Her mother's quilt, somehow still intact, wrapped around a fence post. Books, their pages fluttering in the breeze, caught in the branches of a cottonwood tree. Each item they recovered felt like a small victory. Ryder climbed onto what remained of the walls and used rope to tie down several pieces of canvas tarp he had in his pack, creating a makeshift cover over the most vulnerable parts of the structure. It would not keep out a serious rain, but it was better than nothing. He also boarded up the empty window frames with pieces of wood they pulled from the destroyed roof, making the house at least somewhat secure. As they worked, they talked. It started with practical matters, Ryder asking questions about the property and Frances explaining what she had built here. But gradually, the conversation shifted into more personal territory. Ryder told her he was originally from a small ranch in southern Texas, that he had been on his own since he was 16, working cattle drives and ranch jobs from New Mexico to Montana. He had a restless quality about him, she noticed, as if staying in one place too long made him nervous. "Why did you leave Texas?" she asked as they carried an armload of salvaged clothing back to the barn. He was quiet for a moment, his expression closing off slightly. "Sometimes a place holds too many memories. Get so you cannot breathe without thinking about what you lost. Figured it was easier to keep moving. Frances understood that. Her own past was full of ghosts. Her mother had died when she was 12, leaving her to care for her father and 2 younger brothers in their small Ohio town. When her brothers grew old enough to make their own way, they had scattered, one to California and one to the army. Her father had grown increasingly bitter and difficult, drinking more than he should and blaming the world for his failures. When he won the land in Wyoming in a card game and decided to claim it, Frances had seen it as an escape. But he had died of pneumonia their first winter out here, leaving her alone with nothing but a half-built homestead and a determination not to crawl back home in defeat. "I understand that," she said quietly, running from memories. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them. A recognition, a connection, as if they had each found someone who understood the weight of the past. They did not talk much after that, but the silence was comfortable. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side as the day grew hotter and the sun climbed toward its zenith. Around midday, Frances prepared a simple meal from the supplies in her barn, bread and cheese and dried apples, and they ate sitting on upturned crates in the shade of the barn. Ryder's horse, which he called Storm, grazed nearby on the sparse grass. "How much damage did Rock Springs take?" Frances asked between bites. "Did you ride through it?" "Skirted around it to the north," Ryder admitted. "But from what I could see, it got hit hard. Main Street looked like a disaster. I saw people already starting cleanup, but it is going to take weeks to set things right." Frances felt a pang of worry for the people she knew in town. The storekeeper, Mr. Harris, who always saved her a piece of peppermint candy when she came in. The minister's wife, Eleanor, who had taught her to can vegetables properly. The blacksmith and his apprentice son. All good people who did not deserve this kind of destruction. "I should go into town," she said, thinking aloud. "See if there is anything I can do to help." "Tomorrow," Ryder suggested. "Get yourself sorted first. You will be more used to them if you are not worrying about your own place falling apart." He was right again, though it grated on her to admit it. Frances was used to being the one who helped others, not the one who needed help. But pride would not rebuild her roof or replace her windows. They spent the afternoon doing what they could to make the house livable. It was not much, but by the time the sun started sinking toward the western horizon, Frances had a relatively dry corner where she could sleep, her salvaged belongings stacked neatly in the barn, and a clearer sense of what repairs would be needed. It would take time and money she did not have, but at least she had a place to start. As evening fell, she prepared a more substantial meal using the stores from her root cellar, which had mercifully survived intact. She made a stew with salt pork, potatoes, and carrots, along with fresh biscuits cooked in her cast-iron pan over an open fire. They ate outside, sitting on logs they had dragged over for seats, and watched the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink. "You are a good cook," Ryder said, scraping the last of the stew from his bowl. "My mother taught me," Frances replied. "She said a woman should know how to make a proper meal from whatever she has on hand. It was one of the few lessons that actually proved useful out here." "You ever think about going back east? This is hard country for anyone, but especially for a woman alone." Frances stiffened slightly. "I am not helpless, Mr. Xander. Never said you were." He held up a hand in apology. "I have seen enough today to know you are tougher than most men I have worked with, but being tough does not mean you have to face everything alone." "I do not have much choice," she said, softer now. "This land is all I have. If I give up on it, then everything I have done, everything my father tried to do, it was all for nothing." Ryder nodded slowly, staring into the fire. "I understand that. The need to prove something, to make your mark on the world so people know you were here. Is that why you keep moving? Trying to make your mark, maybe, he admitted. Or maybe I am just afraid of what happens if I stand still long enough for life to catch up with me. There was a vulnerability in those words that touched something deep in Frances's chest. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. His skin was warm and rough, and she felt him startle slightly at the contact before his hand turned over, his fingers curling gently around hers. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers, neither of them speaking. The night air grew cool, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled at the rising moon. Frances could feel her heart beating faster than it should, aware of every place their bodies were connected. She had not been touched with gentleness in so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "I should bed down in the barn," Ryder said eventually, his voice rough. "Give you your privacy." Frances wanted to protest, wanted to ask him to stay close, but she knew that would be improper. Instead, she squeezed his hand once and then let go. "Thank you for everything you did today. I do not know how I would have managed without you." "You would have figured it out," he said, standing and brushing off his pants. "But I am glad I could help." He hesitated, then added, "I will stay on a few more days if you want. Help you get the place more secure. That ranch job will wait, or there will be another one." "I would like that," Frances said, and was surprised by how much she meant it. Over the next week, Ryder proved himself invaluable. He rode into Rock Springs and returned with news of the town's condition, worse than they had feared, with several buildings destroyed and dozens damaged, and supplies to help with the repairs on Frances's house. He said he had a little saved up, and when she protested about him spending his money, he told her she could pay him back when her next crop came in. They both knew that was unlikely, given how hard farming was in this region, but Frances appreciated the fiction that let her accept his help. They worked from sunup to sundown, and slowly the homestead began to look like a home again. Ryder was skilled with carpentry, having learned the trade from a ranch foreman years ago, and he reconstructed a simple roof that was weatherproof if not pretty. The windows were more of a challenge. Glass was expensive and hard to come by, so they made do with oiled cloth stretched over frames, which let in light while keeping out the weather. It was not perfect, but it was functional. As they worked, Frances found herself watching Ryder more than she should. The way his muscles moved under his shirt when he swung a hammer, the concentration on his face when he measured and cut wood, the rare smile that transformed his usually serious expression into something warm and boyish. She caught him watching her too, his eyes following her as she went about her daily chores, tending the animals, cooking their meals, mending clothes in the evening light. The attraction between them was palpable, charging the air whenever they were close. But neither of them acted on it. Frances told herself it was because she barely knew him, because getting involved with a drifter was foolish, because she had more important things to worry about than romance. But the truth was, she was afraid of wanting something so badly only to have it taken away. Afraid of trusting someone and being disappointed. Afraid of how much she was already starting to feel for this quiet, competent man who had appeared in her life at exactly the right moment. On the 8th day after the tornado, they were working together to hang a new door Ryder had built when his hand brushed against hers as they maneuvered the heavy wood into place. The contact was brief, barely a second, but Frances felt it like a spark of electricity running up her arm. She looked up and found him staring at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Frances," he said, his voice low and rough. "Yes." He seemed to struggle with something, then shook his head. "Nothing. Let us get this door hung before we lose the light." But something had shifted between them. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, the silence felt heavier, weighted with unspoken words. Frances could feel the questions building inside her, demanding answers she was not sure she wanted. "How long are you planning to stay?" she finally asked, keeping her eyes on the flames. Ryder did not answer immediately. When he did, his words were careful. "How long do you want me to stay? That is not an answer. Neither was your question." Frances looked at him then, meeting his eyes across the fire. "I do not want you to stay out of obligation. If you have somewhere else you need to be, you should go." "What if I do not have anywhere else I need to be? What if I want to stay?" Her heart hammered in her chest. "Do you want to stay?" Ryder stood, circling the fire until he was standing in front of her. He reached down and took her hands, pulling her gently to her feet. They stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the flecks of darker blue in his storm-gray eyes. "I have been drifting for 6 years," he said quietly. "Telling myself I was looking for something, but never staying anywhere long enough to find it. Then I rode up on a woman standing in the ruins of her home, refusing to break, and I realized maybe I had been looking for the wrong things." His hands tightened on hers. "I am not good at this, at saying what I feel, but being here with you these past days, it has felt more like home than anywhere I have been since I left Texas." Frances could barely breathe. "Ryder, you do not have to say anything," he interrupted. "I know I am just a drifter with nothing to offer. I know you barely know me, but I wanted you to understand why I am staying, not out of obligation, because I want to. Because when I look at you, I see someone worth staying for." She should have been cautious. She should have reminded him and herself that they had only known each other a little over a week, that attraction was not the same as love, that she needed to protect herself. But standing there in the firelight with his hands warm around hers and his eyes full of hope and fear, Frances found she did not want to be cautious. "I want you to stay too," she whispered. "Not just for the help with the homestead, because when you are around, I do not feel so alone anymore." Something in his expression broke open, and then he was kissing her, one hand cupping the back of her head while the other wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. Frances melted into him, her arms going around his neck as she kissed him back with all the loneliness and longing she had been carrying for years. He tasted like coffee and wood smoke and promise, and she never wanted it to end. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ryder rested his forehead against hers. "I should not have done that," he said, though he made no move to let her go. "Why not?" "Because you deserve better than a man with no prospects and a past he is running from." Frances pulled back enough to look into his eyes. "What if I want to decide for myself what I deserve?" he laughed, a short, surprised sound. "You are stubborn, Frances Emmett. I have been told that before." She smiled up at him. "Besides, who says you have no prospects? You are an excellent carpenter. You work harder than anyone I have ever met, and my homestead could use a partner." "Is that what you are offering? A partnership?" "Maybe," she said, feeling bold. "Would that interest you? Depends on what kind of partnership we are talking about." "The kind where we rebuild this place together, where neither of us has to be alone anymore, where we see what this could become if we both stopped running." Ryder studied her face for a long moment, and Frances held her breath, waiting. Then he smiled, really smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "All right," he said. "Partners." They sealed the agreement with another kiss, softer this time, full of tenderness and possibility. And as Frances stood there in the arms of a man who had been a stranger just over a week ago, she felt something she had not felt since before her father died. Hope. The next morning, Frances woke to find Ryder already up and working. He had taken it upon himself to start repairing the chicken coop, which had been partially destroyed in the storm. She watched him from the doorway of her house, still marveling at the strange turn her life had taken. A week and a half ago, she had been alone, facing disaster. Now she had a partner, someone who seemed to genuinely care about her future. It felt like a dream, the kind she might wake up from at any moment. But it was not a dream. Over the following weeks, Ryder proved his commitment in 100 small ways. He rose early and worked late, tackling every repair and improvement the homestead needed. He was patient with the animals, gentle with the land, and considerate with Frances. They fell into an easy domesticity that felt both natural and miraculous. She cooked and kept house, tended her garden and the chickens, while he handled the heavier work and made regular trips to town for supplies. On those trips to Rock Springs, Ryder began to make connections. He helped with the town's rebuilding efforts, offering his carpentry skills freely. People began to know him, to trust him, and by extension to see Frances differently. She was no longer the odd woman living alone on a failing homestead, but part of a partnership. It changed how people treated her, and while part of Frances resented needing a man to legitimize her existence, she could not deny it made life easier. 6 weeks after the tornado, on a warm evening in late July, Ryder took her into town for a dance. Rock Springs was celebrating the completion of the new town hall, which had been built to replace the one destroyed in the storm. The whole community turned out, and Frances found herself swept up in music and laughter, and the simple joy of being part of something larger than herself. She danced with Ryder, his hand warm at her waist, and felt like she was floating. She had forgotten how good it felt to be held, to move with someone in perfect rhythm, to look up and see such tenderness in someone's eyes. Other couples swirled around them, but Frances barely noticed. Her whole world had narrowed to this moment, this man, this feeling of rightness. "What are you thinking about?" Ryder asked as they turned slowly to the music. "About how strange life is," Frances said honestly. "How a tornado can destroy everything and somehow lead to the best thing that has ever happened to me." "The best thing," she nodded. "You, us, this." Ryder's expression grew serious. "Frances, I need to tell you something about why I left Texas." Her stomach tightened with sudden anxiety. "All right." He guided her off the dance floor and out into the cooler evening air. They walked a little way from the hall, finding a quiet spot under a cottonwood tree. Ryder kept hold of her hand, as if afraid she might run once she heard whatever he had to say. "I was engaged once," he began, his voice tight. "Her name was Maria. We grew up together, planned to marry and run my family's ranch. But a year before the wedding, there was an accident, a stampede. My father and older brother were both killed, and the ranch went to pay their debts." He paused, his jaw working. "Maria and her family made it clear that without the ranch, without prospects, I was no longer a suitable match. She broke it off and married someone else within 3 months. Frances squeezed his hand, understanding flooding through her. "So you left." "I could not stay there, seeing her with him, seeing everything I had lost. So I started drifting. Told myself I did not need anyone, did not want to put down roots again. And then I met you, standing in your destroyed house with your chin up and your eyes full of determination, and I realized I had been lying to myself." "About what?" "About not wanting a home, about not wanting someone to build a life with." He turned to face her, both his hands holding hers now. "Frances, I know it has not been long. I know most people would say we are rushing into this, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to build a real partnership with you, not just for the homestead, but for everything. I want to marry you if you will have me." Frances felt tears spring to her eyes. She had dreamed of this, in the quiet hours of the night when she let herself imagine a future with Ryder. But hearing him say the words, seeing the vulnerability and hope in his expression, made it real in a way that took her breath away. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. "Yes, I will marry you. I love you too, Ryder Xander. I think I started loving you the moment you dismounted from your horse and offered to help a stranger without asking for anything in return." He kissed her then, deep and fierce and full of promise, and Frances kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at the same time, giddy with happiness and relief. They were married 3 weeks later in the little church in Rock Springs, with half the town in attendance. Frances wore a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, carefully preserved and altered to fit. Ryder wore new clothes purchased especially for the occasion, looking handsome and nervous as he waited at the altar. The minister, an elderly man named Reverend Thompson, performed the ceremony with warmth and humor, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing. But Frances barely tasted the food or heard the music. All she could focus on was Ryder, the weight of the simple gold ring on her finger, the knowledge that she was no longer alone. That she had a partner, a husband, someone who had chosen her and whom she had chosen in return. When they finally returned to the homestead late that night, Ryder carried her over the threshold of the house they had rebuilt together. Frances laughed at the old-fashioned gesture, but she was touched by it too. Everything about this day had felt like a new beginning, a fresh start after years of struggle and loneliness. Their wedding night was tender and slightly awkward, both of them nervous despite their feelings for each other. But there was also joy in the discovery, in learning each other's bodies and desires. Ryder was patient and gentle, making sure Frances felt safe and loved. And when they finally came together fully, it felt like the final piece clicking into place, making them truly one. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Frances's head on Ryder's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I would have this," she whispered into the darkness. "A husband, a real home, someone who loves me." "Well, now you do," Ryder replied, his hand stroking her hair. "And I intend to spend every day making sure you know how loved you are." Frances lifted her head to kiss him. "I intend to do the same for you." The first year of their marriage was not easy. The homestead required constant work, and money was always tight. But they faced every challenge together, and that made all the difference. Ryder proved to be an excellent farmer, with an intuition for the land that complemented Frances's careful planning. Together, they managed to bring in a decent wheat crop that fall, enough to pay off their debts and have a little left over for improvements. As winter approached, they worked to make the house as weatherproof as possible. Ryder built real windows to replace the oiled cloth, using glass he earned by doing carpentry work for the wealthier families in Rock Springs. He also enlarged the house, adding a second room that could serve as a bedroom or, eventually, a nursery. The thought of children was something they discussed often, both of them wanting a family but also aware of the hardships that could come with bringing children into this harsh environment. "I want our children to have a better life than we did," Frances said one evening as they worked together to prepare the root cellar for winter. "I want them to have opportunities, education, choices." "They will," Ryder promised. "We will make sure of it." The winter of 1878 to 1879 was hard, with heavy snows and bitter cold that tested every seal and joint in their rebuilt house. But they stayed warm, both because of Ryder's careful preparations and because of the heat they generated together. Frances discovered that marriage agreed with her in ways she had not expected. Having someone to talk to share the burden of decisions, to laugh with and hold during the long, dark nights, it changed everything. She had not realized how lonely she had been until she was not lonely anymore. In early spring, Frances discovered she was pregnant. The realization brought a complicated mix of emotions: joy, fear, excitement, worry. She told Ryder over breakfast on a cool April morning, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He stared at her for a long moment, then broke into the widest smile she had ever seen on his face. "Truly, we are going to have a baby, truly," she confirmed, and then squeaked in surprise as he swept her up in his arms and spun her around the room. "I am going to be a father," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to be parents." "We are," Frances agreed, laughing as he set her down and kissed her soundly. "In November, I think, if my calculations are correct." The next months passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Ryder threw himself into making improvements to the homestead with renewed energy, determined that their child would be born into security and comfort. He built a proper crib from polished pine, carved with small animals and flowers. Frances sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands busy while her mind wandered to the future, imagining a small face with Ryder's eyes or her smile. She continued working as long as she could, but as summer progressed and her belly swelled, Ryder became increasingly protective. He insisted she rest more, take on fewer physical tasks, let him handle the heavy work. Frances chafed at the restrictions at first, hating to feel helpless, but she appreciated his concern. And truthfully, pregnancy was more exhausting than she had anticipated. By her 7th month, she was grateful for the chance to sit and rest while Ryder handled the daily chores. Their son was born on a cold November night, arriving after a long and difficult labor that left Frances exhausted and Ryder white-faced with worry. But when the midwife, a capable woman from town named Martha, finally placed the squalling infant in Frances's arms, every moment of pain was forgotten. He was perfect, with a cap of dark hair like his father and strong lungs that announced his displeasure at being thrust into the cold world. "What should we name him?" Ryder asked, his voice choked with emotion as he gazed down at his son. Frances had been thinking about this for months. "James," she said firmly, "after your father, James Emmett Xander." Ryder's eyes filled with tears. He had told her about his father over the long winter nights, about the good man who had worked himself to exhaustion trying to keep the ranch running. Naming their son after him felt right, a way to honor the past while looking toward the future. "James," Ryder repeated, testing the name. Then he leaned down to kiss first his son's forehead, then Frances's lips. "Thank you for him, for everything." "Thank you," Frances replied softly, "for staying, for choosing us." The first year of James's life was a whirlwind of sleepless nights, constant feeding, and a love so fierce it sometimes frightened Frances with its intensity. She had not known it was possible to love someone so completely, so immediately. Every sound James made, every expression that crossed his tiny face, every milestone he reached was a miracle. And watching Ryder with their son was almost as wonderful. He was a natural father, patient and gentle, taking his turn walking the floor with a crying baby, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just staring at James as if he could not quite believe this small person was real. The homestead continued to prosper. They had 2 good crop years in a row, and Ryder's reputation for carpentry brought in additional income. They were able to afford real luxuries now. A new stove for the kitchen, chickens that actually laid eggs reliably, even a few head of cattle. Life was not easy, but it was good. built on hard work and love, and the knowledge that they were building something lasting. When James was 2, Frances became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter arrived on a warm June evening, a tiny, delicate thing with auburn hair and Frances's green eyes. They named her Alina Rose, and she proved to be as different from her brother as night from day. Where James had been loud and demanding, Alina was quiet and observant. But she was no less loved, no less cherished. 2 children, Ryder said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching James chase fireflies while Alina slept in Frances's arms. "We have a real family now." "We always had a real family," Frances corrected gently. "From the moment you decided to stay." He reached over and took her free hand, lacing their fingers together. "Best decision I ever made." The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of farm life and the milestones of their growing children. James grew tall and strong, with his father's work ethic and his mother's determination. Alina proved to be sharp-minded and curious, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. They were happy children, raised with love and discipline, taught the value of hard work, but also given time to play and dream. In 1884, when James was 5 and Alina was 3, tragedy struck Rock Springs in a different form. Tensions between white and Chinese miners working in the coal mines exploded into violence, resulting in deaths and the burning of Chinatown. The Xander family was not directly involved, but the aftermath affected everyone in the community. Ryder spoke passionately against the violence, arguing that all people deserved dignity and justice regardless of where they came from. His stance was not popular with everyone, but Frances was proud of him for standing up for what was right. "The world is changing," Ryder said one night as they discussed the events. "We need to teach our children to be better than this, to judge people by their character and not their appearance." Frances agreed wholeheartedly. She made sure James and Alina understood that all people were equal in God's eyes, that kindness and fairness were values worth upholding even when they were difficult. By 1887, the homestead had grown into a thriving farm. They had over 100 acres under cultivation, a herd of 30 cattle, and a reputation for quality produce. Ryder had built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, with separate bedrooms for the children, and even a small parlor where Frances could entertain the few friends she had made in the area. They had hired a young man named Tom to help with the farm work, which freed up time for Ryder to take on more carpentry projects, and for Frances to focus on the children's education. James was 9 now, old enough to help with real farm work. He took to it eagerly, shadowing his father and soaking up everything Ryder could teach him. Alina, at 7, was more interested in books and learning. Frances had taught her to read, and the girl devoured every book they could acquire. She had a talent for numbers as well, able to calculate accounts faster than Frances could with pen and paper. "She should go to a proper school," Ryder said one evening as they watched Alina poring over a geography book. "Somewhere she can learn more than we can teach her." "There is a school in Rock Springs now," Frances pointed out. "Mr. Henderson built it last year. She could attend there." "I was thinking somewhere bigger. Laramie, maybe, or even back east. She is smart enough to make something of herself if given the chance." Frances felt a pang at the thought of her daughter leaving, but she knew Ryder was right. Alina deserved every opportunity to develop her mind and talents. "Not yet," she compromised. "She is still so young, but when she is older, yes, we will find her the best education we can afford." In 1889, Frances discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise given that she was now in her mid-30s, and had assumed her childbearing years were behind her. But this pregnancy proved to be her most difficult yet, plagued by sickness and exhaustion. The baby, another boy they named Thomas after Ryder's brother who had died in the stampede, arrived early and small. For weeks, they were not sure he would survive, but he proved to be a fighter. By his first birthday, Thomas was thriving, a cheerful, stocky child who seemed determined to keep up with his older siblings. The decade turned, bringing with it the 1890s and a sense of change in the air. The Wild West that Francis and Ryder had known was slowly being tamed. Railroads crisscrossed the territory, bringing more settlers and more civilization. Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, a milestone that felt significant even though it changed little in their daily lives. Rock Springs continued to grow, transforming from a rough frontier town into a more established community with schools, churches, and proper law enforcement. Through it all, the Xander family prospered. Their farm was now one of the most successful in the region, a testament to years of hard work and careful management. But more than the material success, what Francis treasured was the life they had built together. The love she and Ryder shared had only deepened with time, weathering the challenges and celebrating the triumphs as true partners. On a warm summer evening in 1893, as they celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary, Francis and Ryder sat on the porch of their home and looked out over the land they had built together. James, now 14, was in the barn tending to the horses. Eleanor, 12, was inside practicing her piano, a luxury they had purchased the previous year. Thomas, 4, was already asleep, worn out from a day of play. "Do you ever think about that tornado?" Francis asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Sometimes," Ryder admitted. "I think about how I almost kept riding that day. I was so focused on getting to Montana, on keeping moving, that I nearly passed by without stopping." "What made you stop?" "Honestly, I saw you standing there and something in me just knew that if I kept riding, I would be making the biggest mistake of my life." He turned to look at her, his eyes still as storm-gray and intense as they had been 15 years ago. "That tornado took your roof and every window, but you were still standing." I had never seen anything so beautiful or so strong. I knew in that moment that I wanted to be the kind of man who stood beside someone like you. Francis felt tears prick her eyes. After all these years, Ryder could still make her feel like the most precious thing in the world. "You are that man. You have always been that man, only because you made me believe I could be." He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers familiar and dear. "Thank you, Francis, for saying yes, for building this life with me, for giving me a home and a family. You saved me that day as surely as I helped you clean up after the storm." "We saved each other," Francis corrected, squeezing his hand. "That is what partners do." They sat like that as the sun set, painting the Wyoming sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, and Francis reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them to this moment. A tornado had destroyed everything she owned, but in doing so, it had cleared the way for something better. For love, for family, for a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. The following years continued to bring both challenges and joys. James grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over much of the farm's operation as Ryder's back began to trouble him after years of hard labor. Eleanor's brilliant mind earned her a scholarship to a women's college in Massachusetts, a bittersweet triumph that sent her far from home but opened doors Francis could only have dreamed of for her daughter. Thomas proved to be a natural with animals, developing a reputation as someone who could gentle even the most difficult horse. In 1898, James married a sweet-natured young woman named Sarah, the daughter of the storekeeper in Rock Springs, and brought her to live on the farm. Frances welcomed her new daughter-in-law warmly, grateful to have another woman's company and help. Within a year, Sarah gave Frances and Ryder their first grandchild, a boy they named Ryder Jr. Holding her grandson for the first time, Frances felt the circle of life complete itself in a way that was both profound and deeply satisfying. Lena returned home in the summer of 1900, having completed her education with honors. She had changed during her time back east, growing more confident and sophisticated, but she was still fundamentally the same curious, bright-minded girl who had left. She announced her intention to open a school in Rock Springs, determined to bring quality education to the children of Wyoming. Frances and Ryder helped her secure a building and supplies, proud beyond words of what their daughter had accomplished. Thomas, at 11, was still young enough to need his parents, but old enough to have opinions and dreams of his own. He talked endlessly about horses, about breeding better stock, about starting a ranch of his own someday. Ryder encouraged him, seeing in his youngest son a chance to reclaim some of what had been lost all those years ago in Texas. As the new century dawned, Frances found herself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought her to this place. She was in her mid-40s now, her auburn hair streaked with silver, her hands rough from years of work. But she had never been happier or more content. She had a husband who loved her, children and grandchildren who brought joy to her days, and a legacy of work and partnership that would outlast her mortal years. One evening in early 1902, as Frances and Ryder celebrated their 24th wedding anniversary, he surprised her with a gift. It was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with images of their life together. The tornado-damaged house, the two of them working side by side, their children at various ages, the farm in all its seasons. "I made this over the winter," Ryder explained as Frances traced the carvings with gentle fingers. "I wanted you to have something that showed our story, something you could pass down to our grandchildren." Inside the box was a letter, written in Ryder's careful hand. Frances read it with tears streaming down her face. It was a love letter, expressing everything he felt for her, everything they had built together, everything their life meant. It spoke of the tornado that had brought them together, of the decision to stay that had changed both their lives, of the family they had created from nothing but determination and love. "I love you, Frances Xander," Ryder said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you standing in those ruins, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Frances whispered, setting the box aside to embrace her husband. "Thank you for stopping that day. Thank you for staying. Thank you for choosing me in this life." "Best choice I ever made," Ryder replied, echoing words he had spoken so many times over the years. "Best choice I ever made." They made love that night with the tenderness and passion of long familiarity. Two people who knew each other's bodies and hearts as well as their own. And afterward, lying in the darkness with Ryder's arm around her, and his heart beating steadily beneath her ear, Frances thought about how strange and wonderful life could be. How disaster could lead to blessing, how loss could open the door to finding, how a stranger on horseback could become the love of a lifetime. The years continued their steady march. James and Sarah had 3 more children, filling the farm with the sound of young laughter and busy footsteps. Alina's school flourished, becoming known as one of the best in the region. She eventually married a lawyer from Cheyenne, a good man who respected her intelligence and supported her work. Thomas, true to his dreams, started his own horse breeding operation on land adjacent to the main farm, developing a line of sturdy, reliable working horses that were in high demand. By 1910, Francis and Ryder were in their 50s, officially entering old age, though neither felt particularly old. They had handed over most of the farm operations to James, content to take on lighter duties and spend more time with their grandchildren, of which there were now 7. They traveled occasionally, visiting a leaner in Cheyenne or taking trips to see the natural wonders of Wyoming. But they always came home to the land where they had built their life, to the house that had risen from the ruins of a tornado. One warm June day in 1912, 34 years after the tornado that had changed everything, Frances stood in her front yard looking at the house. It bore little resemblance to the original homestead. It had been expanded and improved so many times that almost nothing remained of what had been there before. But the bones were the same, the foundation solid and true. Ryder came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. At 58, he had silver in his hair and lines on his face, but to Frances, he was still the handsome cowboy who had ridden up when she needed him most. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how lucky I am," Frances replied honestly. "About how that tornado was the worst and best thing that ever happened to me. The worst because it destroyed your home, the best because it brought me to you." "Exactly." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever regret stopping? Giving up your plans to keep moving?" "Never," Ryder said firmly. "Not once in 34 years. This is exactly where I was meant to be, with you, with our family on this land. I found everything I was searching for that day I rode up and saw you standing in the ruins." "What were you searching for? A home, a purpose, a reason to stop running?" He kissed her softly. "You, Frances, I was searching for you, I just did not know it until I found you." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the summer sunshine, surrounded by the life they had built together. The farm stretched around them, prosperous and well-maintained. Their children and grandchildren were healthy and happy. The homestead that had nearly broken Frances all those years ago had become a legacy, proof that with hard work, love, and partnership, anything was possible. As they walked back toward the house together, their hands linked as naturally as breathing, Frances reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought about the scared, lonely woman she had been on that terrible morning after the tornado. About the drifter who had stopped to help a stranger and ended up finding a home. About the years of struggle and joy, challenge and triumph that had followed. She thought about the tornado that had taken her roof and every window, leaving her standing in the ruins of everything she had worked for. And she thought about the cowboy who had ridden up at exactly the right moment, offering his hands and his heart and forever changing the course of her life. It had not been an easy road. Building a life on the Wyoming frontier never was. But it had been a good road, walked with a partner who loved her, supported her, and stood beside her through everything life threw their way. That was worth more than any amount of comfort or security. That was the true treasure, the real legacy they would leave behind. As the afternoon sun climbed toward its zenith, and the sounds of family life filled the air around them, Frances knew with absolute certainty that if she could go back and do it all over again, she would not change a single thing. Every hardship, every struggle, every moment of fear or doubt had been worth it to arrive at this place, this life, this love. The tornado had taken everything she owned but her spirit, and when the cowboy rode up, he had helped her build something better than what had been lost. Together, they had created not just a home, but a family, a legacy, a love story that would be told for generations. That evening, as the family gathered for Sunday dinner as they did every week, Frances looked around the crowded table at the faces of the people she loved most in the world. James and Sarah with their 4 children, Eleanor and her husband with their 2, Thomas with his new wife, a horse trainer he had met at a fair in Cheyenne, 7 grandchildren ranging from infants to teenagers, all healthy and thriving. And Ryder, her husband, her partner, her love, sitting at the head of the table with pride and joy written clearly on his weathered face. "I want to say something," Frances announced, tapping her glass to get everyone's attention. The chatter died down as all eyes turned to her. 34 years ago, a tornado came through and destroyed nearly everything I had. I thought it was the end of everything I had worked for. But the very next morning, a cowboy rode up and offered to help a stranger. That cowboy was your grandfather, your father, my husband Ryder. She looked at Ryder, her eyes shining with emotion. That was the day my life truly began. Everything we have, everything we are, grew from that moment. So I want to raise a glass to tornadoes and cowboys, to destruction that clears the way for building something better, and to the love that has sustained us through everything. To tornadoes and cowboys, the family echoed, raising their glasses. To Grandma and Grandpa, James added, grinning. To love that lasts, Eleanor said softly. To family, Thomas finished. They drank together, and then the evening continued with the usual chaos of a large family gathering. But Frances felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. This was what it had all been for. This was the point of all the struggle and sacrifice. Not just to survive, but to build something lasting. To create love and family and legacy. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Frances and Ryder prepared for bed. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of decades, comfortable in their routines and in each other's presence. When they finally climbed into bed, Ryder pulled Frances close, and she settled into her favorite position with her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for tonight," Ryder said quietly, "for those words, for everything." "I meant every word," Frances replied. "You gave me everything, Ryder, a home, a family, a purpose, a love I never dreamed I would find." "We gave those things to each other," he corrected gently. "That is what partnership means. You gave me just as much as I gave you, maybe more. Then we are both blessed. We are indeed." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the Wyoming night outside their window. The wind rustling through the grass, the distant call of an owl, the soft footsteps of some nocturnal creature making its rounds. Sounds that had become as familiar as their own breathing over the decades. "You remember what you said to me that first night?" Frances asked suddenly. "After we kissed by the fire, I said a lot of things that night," Ryder replied with a smile in his voice. "You said being with me felt more like home than anywhere you had been since you left Texas, that when you looked at me, you saw someone worth staying for." "I remember." It was true then, and it is true now. Frances lifted her head to look at him in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "I never told you what I saw when I looked at you that day." "What did you see?" "Hope," she said simply. "For the first time since the tornado, since my father died, since I came west alone and scared and determined not to fail, I saw hope. You represented possibility, Ryder. The chance that I did not have to do everything alone. That there might be someone who would stand beside me, not in front of me or behind me, but beside me as an equal partner. And did I live up to that hope? Every single day," Frances whispered, kissing him softly. "Every single day for 34 years. They made love then, slow and tender and filled with the deep intimacy of 2 people who had shared a lifetime together. And afterward, as they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, Frances felt nothing but gratitude for the strange and wonderful path her life had taken. The tornado had been devastating, yes, but it had also been a beginning. It had cleared away the old, making room for the new. It had brought her to her lowest point, so she could recognize salvation when it rode up on a horse named Storm. It had taken everything she owned but the strength to keep standing. And when she was still standing, broken but unbeaten, a cowboy had ridden up and changed everything. That cowboy had become her husband, her partner, the father of her children and grandfather of her grandchildren. He had helped her rebuild not just a house, but a life. He had given her love and support and companionship through decades of challenges and triumphs. He had chosen to stay when he could have ridden on, and that choice had made all the difference. As Frances finally surrendered to sleep, Ryder's heart beat steady and strong beneath her ear. Her last thought was simple and profound. She was home. Truly, completely, irrevocably home. Not just in this house or on this land, but in this life they had built together, in this love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. The tornado had taken her roof and every window, but she had still been standing when the cowboy rode up. And together, they had built something beautiful from the ruins, something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love and partnership and family that would echo through the generations. That was the real story, not the destruction but the rebuilding, not the loss but the finding, not the ending, but the beginning that had blossomed into a lifetime of love. And it had all started on a June morning in 1878, when a woman refused to break and a man chose to stay. Everything else had grown from that moment, that choice, that meeting of two souls who needed each other more than they knew. Frances Emmett had stood alone in the ruins of her home. Ryder Xander had ridden up as a stranger with nothing to offer but his hands and his heart. Together, they had become something greater than either could have been alone. They had become partners, lovers, husband and wife, parents and grandparents. They had become a family. They had become home for each other, and in the end, that was all that mattered. That was the story worth telling, worth remembering, worth celebrating. A tornado and a cowboy and a love that had lasted through everything life could throw at them, emerging victorious and whole and deeply, completely happy. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, two people who had found each other against all odds slept peacefully in each other's arms, content in the knowledge that they had lived well, loved deeply, and built something beautiful from the ruins of disaster. Their story was complete, their legacy secure, their love eternal. The tornado had taken her roof and every window, but she had still been standing when the cowboy rode up, and that had made all the difference. That had made everything possible. That had been the beginning of the most beautiful love story either of them could have imagined. And they lived happily, surrounded by family and love and the fruits of their decades of partnership, until the end of their days. Together, as they had always been since that fateful morning when disaster had brought them into each other's lives and love had convinced them both to stay.